Hello, it's time for Graphic Policy Radio's The Venture Brothers podcast. Love the Venture Brothers cartoon, but are afraid of missing the plethora of historic references and layers of meaning behind each episode? Join pop culture and history experts Elana Levin, that's me, whose secret identity is being a former film and art student, and Stephen Attewell, whose secret identity is he's an actual historian, for our podcast examining each episode of Season 7 of the hit Adult Swim show. Tonight's podcast is about Season 7, Episode 3, Arrears in Science. And here lies the spoilers. Hey, Stephen.
Hey, how's it going?
Great. Start us off.
Sure. So we start off pretty much from the same events that episodes 1 and 2 ended with, namely the sort of Ventec Tower going crazy. The Venture team attempt to evacuate. Pete White's attack didn't seem to work in terms of actually stopping Jonas Venture, who's awfully resilient for just a head and a weird cyber skeleton. Mm-hmm. I did like Rusty sort of trying to step in and saying, "Dad, if that's you, stop. You are not a building."
Yes, I love that. The "you are not a building" thing felt particularly significant to me because they're talking about the significance of people's edifices and legacies. And so, you know, that particular Venture Tower was built by his brother, not by his dad in the first place. But the sort of idea that, like, you are not the same thing as the structures that you've created or are part of physically, and that your identity is something separate from that, is one that gets lost in the minds of the father Venture quite a bit. So.
Right. And we then get, in sort of quick succession, a kind of like sudden buildup of crisis moment where, like, Phantom Limb and a bunch of attack helicopters arrive to take down the Blue Morpho. Brock, like, tries to get hunter-gatherers to, like, help out because it looks like the Guild of Calamitous Intent is attacking, but he's busy dealing with the scene of the crime at Dummy Corp. And then, you know, sort of everyone's watching as the Blue Morpho arrives. And as we suspected last episode, it is in fact Vendetta.
Da da da! A fan theory proven true. And then Kano speaks. Now, we know that Kano hasn't spoken since he had to kill a great man. And, you know, earlier in the series, people seemed to think they were talking about Jonas Venture, but I never thought that. It turns out the great man he had to kill was the Blue Morpho. And ever since then, he's been silent.
And that makes a lot more sense now that we know more about his working relationship with the Blue Morpho.
Kano is Kano. Kato.
Yeah.
Kano is Kato.
Yeah, Kano is Kato. That's hard to say. So it would make more sense why that would be sort of a more personal thing to him. So we then go to credits, and then we flip back to 4 months ago when Vendetta was forced to reboot because Brock attacked him in the bathroom of Don Hell's club.
Don Hell, of course, being a reference to the rock and roll bar in New York, Don Hills.
Right. Relocated to Colorado Springs, where the Venture compound was originally. And this causes Vendetta to, you know, as we were sort of guessing in that episode, kind of have a flashback that he sees his wife as the plane they're in is going down. He sees Rusty playing with the Monarch, and we've seen that scene before in the mystery photo. Mm-hmm. So that linking Rusty and the Monarch, he sees his wife standing in front of the Newark house with baby Monarch. And this is where I was wondering whether all of this was a RoboCop reference.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, when RoboCop starts to regain his consciousness, it's through a lot of flickers back to his family life and home life, which doesn't look the same visually as, you know, he didn't live in a giant house or anything like that, but the way the technique of cutting into it as he regains his memory is totally how he regained function.
Right. And then they sort of continue with that, where Vendetta just basically walks from Don Hells to Newark, and he's sort of going through his home, and he's hallucinating, remembering being the Blue Morpho, Sorry, go ahead.
It's so heartbreaking, like that whole sequence.
Yeah, and like this episode gets pretty dark, I should say. Just like we're barely scraping the surface of just how terrifying this gets. He remembers Jonas bringing him back from the dead, and then there's like a weird anaphylaxis / Batman Silver Age costume joke that involves the return of the superhero tailor from last season, which is just basically there to set up, like, why is there a second Blue Morpho suit that he can wear? And we then get a sort of a typical Venture Brothers anticlimax, where what stops the whole building from going all Ghostbuster is that the Blue Morpho just sort of, plugs in and shuts him off.
Well, he doesn't really shut him off. He interfaces with him.
Yeah. It's just that's what it looked like at first.
Mm-hmm. God, that really worked. That whole sequence, I think, was incredibly powerful and emotional. And I'm a big sucker for RoboCop, and he always looked like RoboCop, so that makes me happy. And I had said before, like, but RoboCop was a good guy. And yes, indeed, they're parallel. RoboCop is also, underneath it all, a good guy. Oh yeah, and when he travels inside, when Blue Morpho, Vendetta travels inside of the Jonas interface, it's totally just like the numbers thing from the Matrix.
Yeah, there were also some sort of like kind of line art grid stuff. I wasn't sure whether that was like the Matrix or whether there was some earlier kind of holodeck-ish style reference I wasn't sure about. And it is, I think, really kind of telling that what does Jonas's mind look like? It's his gross swinger's pad from back in the day.
Yeah, with all those masks. The women who swim by, because they're underground, are the two actresses that Jonas and Blue Morpho hooked up with that are in the extortion tape. So the fact that the first thing that Jonas's mind points Blue Morpho to see as they converse is a subtle reminder of what he is holding over his head is just really manipulative and evil. Like, he's holding it over this guy's head even in the afterlife.
Yeah. We do learn something really interesting, which is that Jonas's consciousness was in fact awake during the events of Careers in Science, trying to communicate with Rusty and the boys, but they couldn't understand him because
they don't speak Morse code.
Yep.
Which they actually, I think, had a joke about at the time. But I just love that clip of, it's on, it's off, it's on, it's off. I admit to having used that in my real-life conversation. Mm-hmm. And I also enjoy Pete White asking if this is a Scuzzy Protocol, which is like a coding protocol. So,
right.
To clarify, the Scuzzy Protocol, which is spelled SCSI, is a set of standards for physically connecting and transferring data between computers and peripheral devices. In other words, that's an accurate description of how the Jonas problem box and Vendetta are interfacing. It's basically how people used to connect different devices before USB became a thing.
And then we get more of Street Life from Sharky's machine that Jonas sort of has the song stuck in his head, probably because it was the last thing that he experienced in life.
Mm-hmm.
I was reading on, I think, the AV Club comments, and someone pointed out that the song in the movie Sharky's Machine is in the first 3 minutes.
Oh, wow. So that movie did not go on very long.
No, that basically it had just started when the gates opened and killed everybody.
That timing actually does impact my thoughts about who Well, we'll get to it later.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we then learned that, as we had suspected, right, the Blue Morpho died in the plane crash in 1976, and that Jonas brought him back to life, and that, interestingly, the action team, like, who are normally a bunch of amoral assholes, actually have a problem with Jonas bringing him back from the dead. They sort of go all, you're meddling in God's domain thing.
That's probably because they realized they could be next.
Yeah. He does seem to be someone who had a kind of contingency plan for everybody.
Well, my question is, we don't know why Blue Morpho's plane went down, and it went down with him and his kid and wife in it, and that's going to be a mystery that's going to be revealed later on.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible that Jonas did it. It's possible that someone from the guild did it. He was at that point in time, Jonas's, attack dog.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the guild wanted him dead, had a bounty on his head. So, there's lots of possibilities. We also see, by the way, they were kind of right about, like, why it was a bad idea to bring, and it's sort of continuing kind of a Frankenstein theme in the chapter, is that one of Jonas's biggest problems, in addition to being just a giant selfish dick, is he has no attention span. He's not qualified to, care for another life. So within a few years, like, Vendetta has been demoted to dog walker.
Which, if you remember, the villains accusing Blue Morpho of being Jonas Venture's attack dog.
Yeah.
It's just even more heartbreaking because he's been demoted from attack dog to, like, literally just dog.
Yeah, and we see Vendetta, the reason why he was, why Venturian was gotten rid of, is that he snapped when he saw Rusty, who seems to have been a bit of a sadistic kid. That caused him to have memories of Rusty making his kid cry.
Wasn't he, like, trying to, like, burn ants or something like that?
When Venturian tried to strangle him, yeah. So the thing that's interesting that, again, I read this on a comment thread and it sparked a memory, is that Rusty talks about having traumatic memories of a metal man trying to choke him when he writes his musical autobiography last season. So clearly, like, that was, in terms of, like, the legacy and how, like, there's unintended consequences, like, this is part of a long list of things where, Jonas Venture's inattention has caused Rusty to, like, go through trauma.
But also, like, the fact that Rusty was burning ants alive with a magnifying glass, that's, like, such the classic violent kid, science kid, amoral kid who wants to experiment with things at the expense of other living beings. Like, that's him acting out as his dad. And Blue Morpho tried to stop him from that.
And this is when Kano killed him. Which... Now, the interesting thing is, like, in terms of the sort of, like, world-buildy politics side, this is where, like, Brock and the Council square off, where Brock accuses them of breaking the rules, they accuse him of breaking the rules. Brock brings up the Dummy Corp attack, which, of course, Phantom Limb has no idea about, but obviously Dr. Mrs. and the Red Death feel very awkward about. It's just all of these sort of colliding agendas and agreements and secrets.
I love that Dean literally gives Hank an info dump in that scene.
Hank just sort of crosses the street and is like, what the fuck is going on?
Well-timed info dump. I certainly didn't need a refresher, but I think many people would. And for some reason, the notion of Dean giving the info dump is just very funny to me.
Well, I also love Hank's, like, reaction is just like, this is too much for me, but cool, zombie grandpa head. So
then we see...
Yeah,
they're discussing... The team at the villains are talking at the diner, we'll go into details about who they are and what that means in a minute. Dr. Z built Vendetta in his Lost Weekend phase in 1977, where he's going to watch Blondie and the Runaways and the Germs at Whiskey A No Go. The actual club in LA was called the Whiskey A Go Go. Theirs is Whiskey A No Go. That's quite a lineup, by the way. I don't know if that's a lineup that ever actually would have happened, but a girl can dream. There's also a huge Ramones poster in the background of that shot. We see him, Dr. Z, coming in with Harry Nilsson, HAIRYNILSSON, who clearly is the werewolf version of famous 60s, 70s songwriter Harry Nilsson. He wrote a lot of sort of pop standards of the period. He wrote some stuff for the Monkees' later works. He wrote and sang Coconut, which is the outro music from Reservoir Dogs. So I feel like everybody's at least heard that. And then also he sang the theme song of Midnight Cowboy, which actually was a cover, but it's like the everybody's talking about me. I don't hear the word they're saying, only the echoes of my mind. That whole song, which is like
another like New York City street song.
Yes, exactly. It's like so New York, so 70s. And then the other baddie with him is someone who I would argue is possibly an actual supervillain, Shrill Spectre, who is Phil Spector. Phil Spector being the genius music producer, inventor of the wall of sound, which was at the time, like the most complex and robust studio setup that had ever happened in music, and he put it to work in popular music, which was really shocking to people at the time. They're like, why would you do this complex thing? This is just silly pop music. And well, the results were that he produced like the most gorgeous and complex, music of the era. He did all of the famous girl groups. He was the husband, and abusive husband at that, of Ronnie Spector of the Ronettes. And he used to like to pull a gun on people and threaten them. And he shot a woman and is in jail and is basically a real-life supervillain. Like, he's a genius talent and a violent, abusive piece of shit. And his superpower in this is his wall of sound powers. And I just lost it. That's wonderful, wonderful. I also noticed that there's a killer whale movie poster in the background when they enter, but I don't know if that's like a Jaws joke, maybe. I don't know.
Follow up from last week?
Yeah, it might be.
So, learning more about Dr. Z, like, he clearly realizes, like, that Venturian, that this is Venturian. He irons his brain, which is, like, made me wonder if this is a Fooly Cooly reference, which is an experimental anime that was also like a big Adult Swim hit. And of course the like robot having an evil switch. I mean, that is like an old. I think that was in like I want to say like the very first Simpsons Halloween. Holiday.
Yep. The Krusty doll has an evil switch and a good switch, yeah.
Yeah, and we also know that we learned that Vendatta's face was a fake put over the Blue Morpho's face so that no one would recognize him, which always made sense to me because Vendatta's face didn't look like the Blue Morpho's face. So
yeah, and it wasn't that obscured. Somebody would have noticed.
Yeah.
More Frankenstein stuff, right? Like, this is a very Frankenstein-themed piece.
Yes. Although, like, Dr. Z, for being a supervillain is actually one of the more, like, least shitty. Mm-hmm. Although he does immediately get busted for coke, which is just, like, the most 1977 thing ever.
That's basically the point, right? Although, my question, I mean, do you think that the face was was somebody's face in particular?
Not really. I think, if I had to guess, I think it's more that they wanted to have the Blue Morpho's face, but also do more of a RoboCop reference, because it looks a little bit more like
Peter
Weller's face.
Okay, I just want like somebody within the story. Like, is this a body part of someone we know? TBD. Also, we know that Blue Morpho had sex with Dr. Z, so it's sort of a weird connection that Dr. Z remakes him physically.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe that's why he was moved to what is arguably something of an act of mercy. I don't know whether he know that the Blue Morpho had sex with him on Jonas Venture's orders. Getting a little ahead of ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so it's at this point where the NYPD shuts down their conflict because the Thanksgiving Day parade is about to go straight through their area. This made me wonder about, like, how the calendar is syncing up in sort of Venture world versus our world, because it's, like, nowhere near Thanksgiving now, and it wasn't near Thanksgiving when season 6 was airing.
Oh, they never sync their show up with the real seasons, other than like the very first year where they had that Christmas episode, so I didn't really make much of it. But I love the inclusion of the Thanksgiving Day parade, because that is like one of the most iconic things connected to the part of town where the Venture compound is.
Right. And of course, when they can't stand on the street, they decide to go to the diner, which is like the most New York thing, you know. And the Monarch decides he's going to kill the Blue Morpho, which is going to have significance in a minute. So we then, and this is where it's kind of easy to get a little bit geographically turned around. We then move over to the east side, where Ventec has a Macy's Day balloon of Rusty Venture getting inflated, and Hank and Dean are watching from the steps of the Natural History Museum. And this, like, immediately got me in the memories, because one year when I was a kid, we actually went and watched the balloons get inflated from somebody's apartment, which was overlooking them. And it is, I have to say, a very boring process to watch if you're a kid.
I like the diagnosis piece. Do you want to hit on that?
Oh, yeah. So, you know, Hank is sort of talking to Dean about, like, why is it that he goes so method, and brings up a whole bunch of, like, previous characters, like him being the Batman, and some other ones, and, you know, wondering if he's got multiple personality disorder, which is, of course, like a very genre movie thing to have. And Dean, who's, you know, the only one of them going through college, I think more accurately sort of says, no, you've got an overactive imagination and maybe a touch of ADD, not dissociative identity disorder, because that's not really how DID works.
Yeah. I love him saying, is this the museum where everything comes to life at night? Because, I mean, I think that was where things came to life in that movie, Night at the Museum. But for me, it'll always be connecting back to that famous Sesame Street special where they're all in the museum, where Big Bird gets locked in the museum overnight and hangs out with the spirit of an Egyptian king who was a boy. I love that thing. Anyway.
So then the Monarch gets towed again, which is one of my favorite gags from last season, that just, like, you know, they know where the impound lot is because they've broken into it before. And this is where, like, again, things get really fucking dark, because we then get another incident in the Blue Morpho's history where he's having a freak out over the Bob Crane style home movie of him and Dr. Venture.
Sorry, can you explain Bob Crane?
Oh, Bob Crane was was an actor. He was the, like, lead role in Hogan's Heroes, and he had a thing for homemade pornography, and he got beaten to death, and he was portrayed by Greg Kinnear in I forget the name of the movie.
Yeah.
Anyway, so he mentions at the time that, like, he's trying to have a kid, it's not going well, he thinks it's his fault, and Jonas does the really gross thing of basically knocking up his wife under the guise of fertility treatments.
Which is super gross. Like, you have to wonder, did he, like, straight up have sex with her? Probably not.
Or
I think
do
she,
a
like,
semen
went
switch thing.
I think she went under for, quote, treatment, and he had sex with her when she was unconscious. I think he's a rapist.
I mean, it's quite possible, and it's certainly not out of character for him. On the other hand, like, we know that they were all kind of part of the swingers scene, so...
I don't know. Yeah, you're right. It's possible, I guess.
Yeah.
Putting it out
I think it's
there.
how dark you want to go, yeah.
Yeah.
So, as the two of the dead guys watch this scene, you notice that the Blue Morpho is starting to get more human as he remembers being blackmailed, and that, you know, he was never able to get out from under the tape, and was made to do more and more sort of degrading and criminal things. Like, at one point he stole plutonium. Like, that's, you know, that's really towing the line between super science and supervillainy. So the council reassemble at the Starstruck / Stardust Diner at 51st and Broadway. And you had something you wanted to...
Well, I mean, that is a real place. The interior actually looked like the Moonstruck Diner to me, but there's a diner that they're referring to where they have like the whole singing waitresses thing, and it's right near the theater district. I love that Red Death tries to order the Patti LuPone melt after the Broadway singer performer Dynamo, and the side-by-side salad by Sondheim, like the side-by-side by Sondheim musical review of Sondheim. Oh my God.
Yeah, instead of the fries. Which also fits with his whole sort of, you know, like, normcore dad, you know, trying to watch his weight kind of thing. And then he reminisces about when he was in this diner before, in the bad old days when the guild was underground, right before he went off to Gargantua 1.
Da, da, da. And then we get a flashback, an 80s flashback. It's so cool.
Yeah. So what is the Red Death dressed like?
He's dressed as the Kurgan, because you know you had been saying, like, you had been predicting that there'd be a Clancy Brown, because Clancy Brown is the voice of the Red Death, that there'd be a moment where they would really draw on his vast history of characters he's played, and they really finally did it. The Kurgan was when he was the villain on Highlander. And he had the same mohawk, so they just leaned right into that. We have a lot of fun villain concepts in this scene. There's the Supersonic Man, who is Freddie Mercury, totally in his Live at Wembley Stadium getup, which makes sense that you've heard Freddie Mercury sing. Describing it as supersonic is accurate. He has the Flash's powers, and he's wearing a Flash-like T-shirt underneath his famous yellow jacket. And Queen did the soundtrack for the Flash Gordon movie, which is not the same as the superhero The Flash, but it's still a Flash connection. Yeah. He also calls himself, they also say, like, Mr. Fahrenheit, the Supersonic Man, and Freddie Mercury calls himself Mr. Fahrenheit in the lyrics of Don't Stop Me Now.
We also get Laugh Riot, who is a sort of a visual knockoff of the comedian from Watchmen, which was like the 1980s graphic novel that like announced that like comics were serious business now, and also sort of fits with the whole kind of theme of this group of supervillains as being unsatisfied with sort of the traditional arching ways and wanting to kind of deconstruct the whole superhero supervillain thing.
Which is great because they refer to themselves as being new wave, and of course new wave was a term used to refer to like a lot of the 80s music that they'd be referencing there, as well as the comics. Another villain is 8-Bit, who seems to be an 8-bit video game projection, 80s video games. Stab Girl, we have heard of her bravery from the last episode. To me, she looks kind of like Tank Girl from the comics, but that's like a 90s character. She also looks like Harley Quinn from the movies more recently, and the name Stab Girl reminds me of the name Hit Girl from the Mark Millar stuff. That better, the less spoken of, the better.
Right. And this is where we find out then Vendetta came up with the plan to arch Jonas, which, like, that's where it's getting even more dark, because now it's not just the Blue Morpho as this sort of endlessly put upon cuckold / blackmail victim, but now he's like looking for revenge. And this is where Brock calls bullshit, because he says that every OSI grunt knows that it was Sphinx that killed Dr. Jonas Sr. And this turns out to have been a cover story, that the Sovereign used his shape-shifting powers to impersonate the Sphinx commander and claim credit for the death of Jonas in order to prevent OSI from seeking retaliation against the guild.
And of course, when I see Bowie wearing an Egyptian headdress, I think of Bowie wearing an Egyptian headdress in a very famous photo spread he did, bridging his look from the Hunky Dory album with his reinvention as Ziggy Stardust. Now, that was the early 70s, and this is the 80s, but still, it's a real visual reference there.
Right. And here we learn a little bit of backstory that the Sovereign's claiming of credit set off the Pyramid Wars, which is like parallel to basically G.I. Joe versus Cobra, that Brock like fought in when he was first working for the OSI, and that like learning that this was all a lie is like a, you know, really fucks with his head. And we also see, you know, meanwhile, that the paperboy on Gargantua 1, like, announcing the movie, this is Bud Manstrong, who talks about being the paperboy on quote-unquote movie night in Careers of Science. So, like, we're really doubling back to that episode, as this episode really gets into the question of who killed Jonas Venture.
Real quick, though, can you remind our listeners who Bud Manstrong is?
Oh, Bud Manstrong was the sexually repressed / Manchurian candidate astronaut who was left in charge of Gargantua 1 in the episode Careers in Science, who then, when the satellite fell to Earth, gained momentary heroism when he accidentally piloted Gargantua 1 into a terrorist headquarters. And this is the episode, I'm forgetting the name of it, where they all are invited to the West Wing for dinner. Which, sort of, we're seeing all of these kind of like tying back of, everything leads back to Gargantua 1. Mm-hmm. So we see a fight between Vendetta and Jonas, but we don't see the conclusion of that fight, which strikes me as a very deliberate choice on the part of the creators.
Yeah, definitely. So who do you think opened the gate? So, I'm not sure, because it could be Vendetta. And we should also say, to add more ambiguity to these proceedings, that the action team were late to movie night because of Colonel Gentleman. So they didn't see it either. They see they get Jonas's body and are about to put him in the problem machine. And by the way, this is even more darkness. Rusty leaving behind his little plastic toy causes them to stumble and break the frozen body. So, in a way, going all the way back to Careers in Science, it kind of is Rusty's fault that his dad was not successfully revived. Fault / blessing, right?
Yeah, exactly, especially since we know, what kind of person he is now. So I'm not sure. I think, if they wanted it to be Vendetta, that I think they had an opportunity to directly show it in this episode. I don't think it was, I think the Red Death would say if that was him.
Yeah.
Or his team.
I don't know if Red Death would say that in front of Brock, because Brock is so aligned with Rusty.
No, but I think he would have said it last episode. When he talked about being at movie night. Right.
That's a good point. Just to Dr. Girlfriend. Okay.
Yeah, so I'm sort of leaning towards, like, someone on the Venture side. I don't know. So
Kano, maybe then. Certainly he had motivation.
no, because he was still traveling to the spaceship.
Oh, right. Well, I don't know who on the Venture side would have been there then, frankly.
I mean, Bud Manstrong's the only named character, but he's a paper boy, so I don't know why. Anyway, I think this is a question that we need to keep under our hats.
Mm-hmm.
So it's at this point that Action Man has a stroke, which was predicted by Dr. Orpheus way back in episode 11 of season 1. The episode titled Past Tense, when he said something like 2 years, 7 months, a stroke. And that was an episode that was all about Rusty's time at college, and specifically when he found out that his dad was dead. So it's sort of all circling back around to movie night at Gargantua 1. So let me see. What's next?
The Monarch and the 21 discuss life model decoys.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's not even really anything for us to explain. It's just like 21 just straight up makes the reference, and it's like, yeah, hunter-gatherers.
Yeah, no, but we have to explain life model decoys. Decoys is a reference to Marvel Comics, Nick Fury. They had invented a thing in the Steranko era of Nick Fury where he would just make fake robotic copies of himself that basically also had his intelligence in them. And so whenever you'd see like Agent Nick Fury dying, it was actually just one of his life model decoys. And this is a joke that Marvel, not a joke, like a narrative trick that Marvel pulls out quite frequently. It's really a big trope over there.
Right. And we should also say for those of you who are just sort of tuning in recently, that hunter-gatherers is sort of like 50% Hunter Thompson and 50% Nick Fury. So,
very true.
So the two sides finally agree that basically they're going to take joint custody of the Blue Morpho, and they're going to disassemble him. Meanwhile, back at the Ventec headquarters, which has been sealed shut because of the Venture seal smashing down in front of the doors, which, kind of obvious symbolism, Pete White uses the shrink ray to get the Action Man and company out of the building and to a hospital, and isn't a great shot. And Colonel Gentleman uses the phrase Maggie's Drawers, which is, if you've seen the movie JFK, is a reference to Lee Harvey Oswald supposedly being a very bad shot, hence why there had to be a second gunman on the grassy knoll.
But what does Maggie's Drawers mean?
It just means that you can't shoot. That you miss.
Oh,
you're a bad shot.
That's term for it. Got it.
Yeah, that if you went for a whole round and didn't hit the target, that you were just called Maggie's Drawers.
Got
I don't
it.
think there's a specific thing. So it also sets up Dr. Orpheus communicating with a roach in order to take the Action Man and co. to a hospital.
Which is so Ant-Man. That whole thing with Dr. Orpheus communicating with the cockroach, and they all pile on his back. That's Ant-Man's powers, and it was adorable. And I like the little rhyme he did.
Yeah, so at this point, as the Blue Morpho is distracted, Jonas communicates with Rusty over Wi-Fi that he wants to swap his brain into the Blue Morpho's body, which is just this is getting even more dark by the second. It's really where the tension just starts to ratchet up and up and up and up and up. And Billy is the one who says he won't do it because he's one of the few characters in this episode who has a moral conscience.
And then, Billy is definitely the moral conscience here, but Pete White is really the action hero of the episode. He's the person who's just keeping cool when the heat is all around and taking actions that make sense in order to address situations, like bringing out the shrink gun to get them outside the building. That was super smart. Even if he is a bad shot, he's a real problem solver. And he also is charging at things with an axe earlier. I think he's really found himself in a lot of ways, and I think Billy has too, which is why I have a prediction. I think either Pete or Billy or both are going to die heroically some point this season. Okay. I just have a feeling about it.
All right, well, we'll have to keep an eye on it. So it's at this point that the Monarch sort of bursts in because he is willing to do the swap because he's amoral like that. And we then split to the Blue Morpho and Jonas arguing about who actually killed who. We kind of already discussed like who actually was responsible for movie night, but it's enough to get the Blue Morpho to sort of temporarily log out. And what does he see?
So Blue Morpho glitches, and his brain identifies the facial geometry of the Monarch, who is right in front of him, and IDs him as his son, Malcolm Fitzcarraldo. The question we have here is, oh my gosh, Fitzcarraldo, which made us both think about the film by Werner Herzog, and we have different thoughts about the significance of that. I thought about the relationship between Werner Herzog and his lead actor, Klaus Kinski. Herzog was a very abusive man. He pulled a gun on Klaus Kinski. He put him in all kinds of life-threatening and dangerous situations, as well as all of his other actors. Just truly unacceptable. And Kinski almost died making works for Herzog, and it made me think about how the Blue Morpho had his own life under threat constantly through his partnership with Jonas Venture. Yeah,
whereas I kind of felt like, I mean, I think you're absolutely right about the Herzog-Kinski thing, but in terms of specifically the character of Fitzcarraldo, I think the Monarch is actually slightly a better fit, because the whole thing about Fitzcarraldo is he's a romantic obsessive. Like, he's got this impossible dream of trying to bring an opera house up the Peruvian Andes. And the Monarch has always been sort of like similarly this kind of, I mean, romantic, not in the sort of lowercase r sense, but he's always been this character who's absolutely obsessed with Jonas Venture and sort of almost, arching for arching's sake. He's not a sort of a careerist villain. He's not a punch clock villain. He's sort of an artistic villain in that sense. And this is where the fight between the Blue Morpho and Jonas spills out into the physical, with sort of Jonas on top of the Blue Morpho, on top of Rusty, with the Monarch on top. So you sort of got fathers and sons as they go down the escalator, and then the Blue Morpho's jet boots take them out of the hole in the building. And then, of course, the Monarch and Rusty are saved by the Rusty Venture Thanksgiving Day balloon, whereas the fathers land on the steps of the Natural History Museum and are both dead, and the Monarch takes the credit for the hit.
Oh my God, I just thought about this. The fathers land on the museum steps because they are the relics. They belong in a museum. They're the past.
Right. And also, who are they right in front of the statue of?
Teddy Roosevelt?
Right. Who is this, likewise, this sort of, uber white dude, explorer, colonialist. I mean, the statue is literally him on a horseback with, a Native American on one side and, a Rough Rider on the other, kind of being the loyal, non-white servants. And it's sort of you can definitely see a kind of critique of that era, and that's very close to, the whole era of pulp heroes like Doc Brass and The Shadow, who these guys were, clearly patterned after.
Not Doc Brass is the fictional one.
Sorry, not Doc Brass. Yes, I always who's the original one? Doc Samson.
Yep, Doc Samson, Man of Brass.
Man of Brass. That's it. But I did get The Shadow.
Indeed,
I know The Shadow.
So what I keep thinking about is, what does it mean that the super science dad is evil and that the action hero dad is the good guy?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think they're kind of both a little bit more, like, one is definitely more sinned against than sinning, but, like, they're both pretty morally compromised people.
Sure. But the degree is quite striking. And also the fact that, like, the emotional reaction that Vendetta has to seeing his son is, like, that recognition and, like, seeing him is, like, very powerful. He clearly loves him and very much cares.
Yeah, and, you know, Monarch, by contrast, sort of doesn't have the freedom in the moment to express his emotions because, like, he has a moment where he says daddy, where he's, like, clearly recognizing, like, who this person is. And I should say, like, before that, like, when the Monarch and Rusty land on the balloon, they're, like, holding each other in their arms. Like, it's clearly a moment where they've, like, maybe just for now, sort of put aside their one-sided vendetta. But, you know, it's also really interesting that, like, the Monarch takes this moment to, like, totally recast his status. That now he's the guy who killed the villain killer. He's the guy who killed Jonas Venture Sr. And that kind of makes him the, like, you know, for the moment, the top villain.
Well, the son must kill the fathers in order to find himself in his power.
Yeah, it's very sort of Joseph Campbell slash hold on, what's the White Goddess? Sorry, yeah, I was blanking
and
on the
Star
other
Wars, everything. Yes.
Oh, and the Golden Bough and every other weirdo mythology book.
Oh gosh. I mean,
so,
yeah, like the bad dad and the good dad are both killed in order for the son to move forward in his life. So, yeah, post-credits scene.
Yeah, so we sort of see the cleanup. OSI gets Jonas Venture's head. The Guild of Calamitous Intent takes possession of Vendetta / the Blue Morpho. So there's a possibility that both of these characters could be back or not. The Action Man is in a coma.
Again.
Yeah, and the Triad is moving to not Greenwich Village, but
to the Lower East Side. So they do make when they're looking at the property online that Dr. Orpheus wants them to acquire. He points out that this particular building has a Doctor Strange style window, which it does, but it's actually they're actually referring to a real actual building that's in the Lower East Side that I actually recognized looking at this you can see on the web ad the end of the word Rivington Street. So I looked up what is exactly the name of that abandoned synagogue on Rivington Street. And it is the Emery Roth-designed synagogue on Rivington Street, formerly Adath Jeshurun of Jesse, which was a Jewish Romanian synagogue built in 1903. It's actually the synagogue that the Gershwins went to, George and Ira. So, yeah, we have the Triad locating themselves in a very real New York building, which is a building which is now actually an art studio. It's not an operational shul at this point.
Right. And so after, you know, the status quo has now been restored and peace is returned to the universe, Team Venture goes up to the roof of Ventec Tower to watch the Macy's Day Parade, and lo and behold, the rusty balloon breaks free and careens down Ventec Tower, knocking over a lamppost, and this is a reference to a real incident that happened on Thanksgiving 1997 when there were high winds and the handlers lost control of Barney the dinosaur, and it knocked over a lamppost and killed a woman.
What a terrible, pointless way to die. Good God.
Yeah, so, you know, this is sort of a very ominous note for the episode to end on.
We even get like an ode to humanity kind of thing from like the TV broadcasters, the US.
Yeah, and you can see that sort of everyone's scattering as, you know, they're up on the roof and this giant balloon is heading straight for them. So it's not all as well.
Well, I mean, also like the ashes of Jonas Venture probably got lost in that moment.
Oh yeah,
evacuated the roof view.
Well, ashes and or head. I mean...
my goodness. Yeah, ashes and or head, TBD, right? So that's scary.
Yeah. So what did you think of the episode?
I mean, this was a wonderful episode. Everything was building towards it. It totally paid off. You know, one of my critiques of the show is I feel like sometimes they resolve conflict by deflating it in order to make everybody happy, which is a fine and fun and generous act to do when you love your characters as much as these writers do. But it only means something if it's also possible for people to experience pain. And I think that this episode really struck the perfect balance of doing that thing, like you said in the beginning of the episode, where they actually resolve something complicated quickly through, and it sort of decompresses this tension moment, but in actually having it have a real emotional payoff and themes. And I think this is incredibly strong work.
Yeah, I mean, my feeling is that it is the best episode of the season. It is probably the best episode of the last 2 seasons, and one of the best ones ever, just in terms of, like, as you said, the sort of the combination of sort of real emotional payoff combined with the sort of deep textual layering that they do, where, you know, you're getting payoff across, you know, 6 seasons, and it's all sort of fitting into place perfectly. I'm really impressed.
Yeah. Reflecting back on the name of this episode, Arrears in Science, Arrears spelled Arrears. Arrears in Science plays off the episode title Careers in Science, which was an episode in season 1, and an episode that we keep comparing to this one because there were so many plot points in that episode that are brought up here as well. That episode, Careers in Science, is the one that took place on Gargantua 1, where we're first introduced to the space station. We see Bud Manstrong, and they first encounter the problem light. It's on, it's off, it's on, it's off, and so on. This episode really concludes all of these open plot points from that episode. The word arrears means money that is owed and should have been paid off earlier. So this is the episode where the debts of the fathers are finally paid off. It's really great symmetry. Absolutely. I'm glad we have more episodes in this season, although it might not be that many more. But we both said that we felt like this seemed like it was actually the finale of the last season.
Yeah. Yeah, if like, you know, it's not necessarily a critique, because I think, like, if you binge this instead of watch it when it comes out, I think you won't notice or care. Mm-hmm. But it does feel like the last 3 episodes were the end of season 6, that they just sort of ran out of money, or time, or whichever, and you know, just sort of kicked it down to this season, which kind of, you know, makes me wonder, like, okay, so how much, you know, new arc is there to this season? But on the other hand, like, I'd much rather have payoff than no payoff.
Oh, absolutely. I mean? We know of at least 2 more episodes, but there might be more than that. Yeah. Is that our understanding? Okay, well,
there's 2 episodes that are listed on, like, all the wikis as having like episode titles and air dates. I don't know if those are the only 2 episodes.
So it's possible we might only have 2 more.
It is possible.
Well, great moment. Love this episode. A+++. So thanks for listening, guys. Continue to keep listening to us on Blog Talk Radio or on iTunes. I'm hoping to be able to get these episodes up on SoundCloud or Stitcher, but somebody had a baby, and that's not me, Lord knows. So we're still trying to coordinate some of that on the graphic policy side. Where can our listeners find you online, Stephen?
So you can find me on Twitter at Stephen Attewell. You can find me on Tumblr and WordPress at Rage for the Iron Throne.
And I'm on Twitter all the goddamn time at ELANA_Brooklyn. That's Elana_Brooklyn. Let me know what you think. Want your feedback? Should there be less singing? Should there be more singing? And join us next week for our next episode of the Venture Brothers podcast. Go Team Venture podcast.
Okay. We are never getting that right. We need better coordination.
This is just because we're not in the same room.
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
See you next week.
All right, bye.
This is a production of Graphic Policy Radio, brought to you by graphicpolicy.com, the site where comics and politics meet. Be sure to visit us every day for news and articles from a political lens on geek culture and beyond. graphicpolicy.com.
Hey, thanks for watching the previous video from Graphic Policy Television. Just by watching, you help support our site. Thank you so much. Now, if you're watching these videos, you probably care about geeky things like movies, television, comic books, toys, games, video games, you name it. You can go and subscribe right now to our YouTube channel to stay in touch and catch all the new videos, or check out our website at graphicpolicy.com. There's a nice link on this end of the video. But as always, thank you for watching. Keep on rocking and keep it geeky.